Good evening, everyone. I'm Charles Assisi here from Mumbai, and like most of you friends from the Founding Fuel community know that every year we look forward to D. Shivakumar, our trusted curator, to put together his list of the best books of the year. And many of you were here last week as well. And this isn't just about picking books, it's about having conversations with some of the finest minds out there to explore ideas and themes that these books uncover. And through Shiv's picks and lively conversations, we hope to spark fresh perspectives and inspire meaningful conversations for everyone, no matter what their interests be. And we are so delighted to have Sir John Kay with us. His book, The Corporation of the 21st Century, topped Shiv's list this year. And he was supposed to be with us last week, but for reasons that were beyond his control, he couldn't make it. But he is with us this evening. John, thank you so much for joining us. We're absolutely delighted that you are with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm sorry our planned meeting last week didn't work out as we had electricity problems in England.
Uh, well, it happens to the best of us, I guess. But like Shiv said, it just happens. And I guess by now, those of you who are here and those of you who are logged in on YouTube, you know that as the conversation rolls on, please key in your questions into the chat box here and YouTube. Request you to keep your questions succinct, and we'll pick up the questions for the interactive session later. And Shiv, before you take over, I didn't get a chance to ask you one question,
Yes, please.
and this has been coming in, and this has been asked by quite a few people. In our last session, you spoke of how you devour a book in 2 to 3 sittings on the outside, and how that has helped you. Now, I came across another pointer that if you read at least 20 to 30 pages, or at least 20 pages every week. That amounts to about 360 for 365 days. That adds to about 7,300 pages, and that's at least 30
20 books.
each year. And this puts you among the top 1% of all humanity. So, question to you here, Shiv, is it okay with you to be a hare or a tortoise? Would this pass muster to you when it comes to reading?
Yeah, if you read 20 pages a book, a typical book about 55,000 words will have about 300 pages. So you're going to take 15 days for it. And trust me, if you take 15 days for a book, it's most likely you'll forget what you started with. So I think it's better to read rapidly and quickly and assimilate quickly, underline, highlight whatever you want to do, and refresh yourself and move on. Because in today's fast-paced world, you also need to learn quickly. Slow learning does not work to the same degree, at least in my opinion.
Okay. So Shiv, you're sticking to your guns. Perhaps we should, we should take this offline and have a debate around this one. But great, Shiv. I'm going to pass the baton on to you and all yours, Shiv.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor K. It's an absolute delight to be here. I've read so many of your books and followed you over the years. And I personally thought that The Corporation of the 21st Century was an outstanding book. Outstanding book for the research in it, for the insights from it, and the direction that you're setting. So I have a few questions for you before I pass it on to audience questions, which will be handled by Charles and IG. My first question to you is, you talk a lot about capitalism having gone wrong. Where do you think capitalism went wrong? And what were the early signals that all of us missed?
Well, I'm not sure it's quite right to put it as capitalism having gone wrong. I think what has happened is the language of capitalism no longer describes very well the business environment we now face. So that kind of Marxist thinking came into being in a world in which essentially rich men set up factories, steel works, textile plants, etc., and employed people, relatively unskilled laborers from the fields, in order to work in these plants. So there was a distinction between capital and labor, relatively homogeneous, unskilled labor, and people who provided the equipment with which they worked. That was true even kind of a century ago, or in the early 20th century, when Henry Ford set up what was the biggest
Yeah.
industrial plant in the world at Dearborn in Michigan, and controlled the whole operation. And that was the language of capitalism, of labor and capital. But business isn't like that anymore. Business now consists of teams of people working together. People can take the plant home with them. And during the COVID pandemic, many of them did. It's not the factory which is the center or the unskilled labor which is working in it. It's rather that the modern corporation consists of teams of people working together.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, you finished, Professor K?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So on the point of teams working together, you mentioned in your book that we must move from a rigid command and control system, and this must give way to a collaborative and inclusive system. How would you, describe a collaborative, inclusive system? What would be some practices, some processes which you believe will lead to that?
Right. We need to move away from the command and control system that says Henry Ford is the boss and he determines the assembly line and what everyone ought to do in order to contribute to production. If one takes a corporation like Apple, what's happening is you have a constantly evolving process in which groups of people are developing new product, some of them coding, some of them designing, others thinking of ways in which the products can be used. They're working together to produce a stream of new products in this kind of way. There's no hierarchy anymore in the sense that there isn't someone who decides what people are going to be doing. I think a phrase I've found very helpful in thinking about all of this is mediating hierarchy, because you need some sort of hierarchy, because people need to know when decisions are taken and what they are. So you need some degree of hierarchy for that. But the mediating hierarchy is one in which the person at the top of the hierarchy is identifying what these decisions are and taking account of the variety of views and, importantly, the variety of different experiences in the corporation which contribute to all of that.
Okay, thank you. You describe in the book the new age tech companies, you describe them as hollow companies who do little themselves and almost outsource everything to somebody else. These companies, you state, work on intellectual capital as opposed to the financial capital of the past, which you so eloquently answered in question one. Could you help us understand what makes a hollow company, and is this the trend of the future?
I think it is the trend of the future. And I think it's quite interesting to think about this word entrepreneur, because in its French origins, it means the person who takes things together, puts things together. And I think that's what the modern entrepreneur does and should do. It's not a matter of him having the ideas which everyone else implements. It's rather he brings together the range of capabilities. Now, the hollow corporations we see today are of many kinds. I've mentioned Apple, which is a good example of a hollow corporation in the sense that if you get an iPhone or a MacBook, it says designed in California, but that's all that happens in California. It's manufactured, well, it will be assembled probably in China by Hong Hai,
Foxconn, yeah.
Foxconn, subsidiary of a Taiwanese on Hai. Actually, the largest supplier of parts for an iPhone turns out to be Samsung, who are, of course, Apple's rival in selling smartphones, and so on. So Apple in this sense makes nothing. Apple equally designed the iPhone, but it doesn't assemble it, and it's Foxconn who put the iPhone together. And more than that, they opened the system so that people could write apps for it. And of course, thousands of people have written apps for it, which we have on our phones. So in this sense, what Apple is doing is it's the coordinator of a whole variety of activities and functions, few of which it actually physically performs itself.
Okay. Now, in your book, you talk of the aware consumer. As somebody who loves the products and services which are produced by e.g. tech companies, but equally this consumer hates the companies which make those products or services or deliver those products or services. So in a sense, are we going to see a more activist consumer? And what will this mean for business if more of these types of consumers come into the fold?
Well, it depends what we mean by activist consumer. I think we have this phenomenon today, which I call love the product, hate the producer. Google and Facebook have millions of customers, more customers, in fact, than any company historically had imagined having. It's very different in that sense from Carnegie's steelworks or Ford's assembly line. They have vast numbers of customers, billions of customers in each case. But these people, the companies that produce them, are typically vilified in the Western press. You don't read favorable descriptions of Mark Zuckerberg and people like that. And indeed, we had the extraordinary phenomenon just in the last couple of weeks of the murder of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare. This is a healthcare company, and yet people hate it. So it's quite extraordinary. And we see this, it's not just that people hate it, it's that they especially hate the fact that it's a healthcare company. Pharmaceutical companies 50 years ago used to be, for 10 years, Merck was the most admired company in the world. Today, pharmaceutical companies are at the bottom of the heap in terms of Gallup's rating of the performance of different sectors in the US economy. So it's this phenomenon which I love the product, hate the producer. Now, there are several implications of that. There is what you described as consumer activism, and unfortunately that has been something that's rather hijacked in an ESG agenda so that companies set up departments to work about some of the environmental consequences of what they do. That's not unimportant, but it's not the key part of what they do. And it's not what people are worried about when they're critical of United Healthcare. They're critical of the way in which the business itself is conducted. And what I think we need to do is we need to manage our businesses, including these businesses, in a more ethical way. A lot of the pressure comes to regulate these tech companies. There's more and more emphasis on the ways in which we need to write rules in order to constrain what Google and Facebook and these companies do. I don't want to see that ever growing plethora of regulation. I think we've seen that in financial services, we've seen it in pharmacology, we're now seeing it in tech. And this is intrusive and often counterproductive. What I would like to see is companies internalizing for themselves the kind of values which people are trying to impose on them by regulation. And that's the method that reconciles, in my view, the demand for regulation, the demand for more social responsibility on behalf of these companies. On the one hand, it gives that kind of social responsibility, but it internalizes what these firms do and absorbs the ethics into business behavior.
Yeah, a follow-up question on what you just said, Professor K, is, can tech companies self-regulate themselves? And can you give us any good examples of companies who've done it?
I think in large part they need to self-regulate themselves, and they in large part do. And I take the I gave you two examples of financial services and pharmacology. And they are both industries where half a century ago they did regulate themselves in large part in the ways in which we would want. That financial services companies, if you think of the films of Mary Poppins or It's a Wonderful Life, you see retail financial services provision as being a kind of model of rectitude. It's very far from that now. Similarly, Merck was for a decade the most admired company in the United States from mid-80s to early 90s. And that was, George Merck actually famously said, medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. And he went on to say, and the better we have remembered that, the larger the profits have been. And that was exactly what Merck did. It was a company with a very strong sense of social mission and social purpose. And by realizing that mission and purpose, it made a great deal of money. That's the kind of business I admire, and it's the kind of business we need to see more of.
Yeah. You argue in the book that we must redefine capital as a combination of personal, social, natural factors. So my question to you is, who might oppose this new definition that you're proposing, and why would they oppose it, if they opposed it?
Well, I'm not sure that I am proposing that redefinition. I think it's happened. And it's interesting that because we've talked about the language of capitalism for so long, people have invented new forms of capital to identify other things they think are important. So they started talking about human capital, and then they talked about social capital, and now people are trying to measure natural capital. And you have arbitrary and often really rather silly measures invented of these. I looked the other day, there was someone who was a group of people who were prosecuted for their attempt to remove the trees, some of the trees on the border between Scotland and England. And it was a historic tree, and they also damaged Hadrian's Wall in the course of doing so. And there was an attempt to value, as it were, Hadrian's Wall. Well, no one would build Hadrian's Wall now. It's only of interest because it was built 2,000 years ago, and the cost of building, you wouldn't want to build something like that at all, and the cost of building it today would be enormous. These kind of calculations are elaborate, widely undertaken, and in my view, quite meaningless. We need to stop trying to quantify everything in this sort of way. People who damaged Hadrian's Wall did a great deal of harm. And it's not a matter of putting a pounds, shillings, and pence number on that harm to criticize what it is that they're doing, that they did.
You talked of two concepts, shareholder value and the knowledge economy. The combination of these two factors, how does this differ from for emerging markets or developing economies compared to developed economies?
I think that's a very interesting question, and obviously a very important one for us to talk about in this conversation. When we began, I talked about the ways in which companies, the large companies of the world, had changed. We'd moved from the Ford Motor Company, Carnegie Steel Works, and the like. We'd moved from these kind of businesses to the modern people-driven businesses, the Apples, the Facebooks, and so on of the world. And that's a fundamental change. Now, it's a change that has mainly happened in the Western developed world, in what we're inclined to call now the global north. It's a phenomenon of the global north, and some of the manufacturing is outsourced, and an increasing proportion of it is outsourced to developing countries, particularly Asian countries. We notice the way in which a company like Nike, for example, is simply a retail and distribution corporation in the United States, and all its products are made in Asia. So that in this sense, Asia as a developing country, Vietnam and Philippines, which make quite a lot of their products, are more like the businesses of which characterized Britain and America in the 19th and early 20th century. Now, a country like India is in quite an interesting role in all of this, because what I see as characterizing India is in many ways higher levels of education and Western developed education than is true for many of these countries. So it's less the kind of assembly line activity of making shoes or assembling Apple iPhones than actually outsourcing services from developed countries to developing ones. And I think India, then, in this sense, may have an intermediate role between the past and the present in terms of the functions which are undertaken here, as hollow corporations, as I've described them, are able to outsource some of their service activities, some of their people-driven activities to countries like India.
Yeah, thank you. You say that maximizing shareholder value has come at the expense of ethics and long-term stability. And you cite GE and Deutsche Bank as examples. Now, with your vast experience, what are these type of mistakes which current companies are making, which could put them at risk for the future?
Well, I mentioned just a few minutes ago United Healthcare, which is a pretty clear example of that kind of problem. A particularly powerful example, actually, is the story of Boeing. And Boeing, we all remember as being the world's leading aircraft company of the 20th century. And way back in the 60s, it developed the 737, the 747. The 737 is the best-selling plane ever. It's the mainstay of short-haul flights throughout the world. And the 747 really revolutionized intercontinental air travel. I mean, certainly the first time I visited the United States or came to India, it was in the 747, of course it was. So it had redefined the world civil aviation aircraft market. And 20th century CEO Bill Allen famously said, our aim is to live, breathe, and sleep the world of aeronautics. That was Boeing in the 20th century. In the 21st century, at the turn of the century, there was actually a merger of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And although Boeing was a much the larger company, it was actually in important respect a cultural takeover by McDonnell Douglas, which was a much more shareholder value oriented company than Boeing had been. Indeed, Harry Stonecipher, who was a McDonnell Douglas executive actually, who became CEO of Boeing, famously said, people say this is a great engineering business. It is a great engineering business, but people invest in a company because they want to make money. And when Stonecipher was forced out, not because of his business philosophy, but because of his personal conduct, he was replaced by Jim McNerney, who was an acolyte of, who was a protege of Jack Welch's at General Electric, and a believer in the shareholder value concept. And we all know what happened as a result of that. Instead of designing a new short-haul jet to replace the 737 and compete with Airbus's 320, what Boeing did was they reconfigured their 737 into something they called the 737 MAX. And of course, it was the 737 MAX which crashed in 2018, 2019, with consequences we all know. And I was just reading this morning that the astronauts were stranded on the International Space Station as a result of the inability of the Boeing craft to take them back to Earth again. They're going to have to wait a bit longer than they thought for Elon Musk to come and rescue them. Boeing is, I think, a very powerful example of a company that was once the leading civil aircraft company in the world and has essentially lost that position as a result of focus on shareholder value.
You mentioned in the book that we need a new lexicon to run businesses now. What specific terms or lexicon from the past would you drop? And what, if you may suggest, would be 2-3 new, words or lexicon that you might introduce?
I've hinted earlier that I wish we would stop using the phrase capitalism because it dates from an era in which the capitalists built the plant and unskilled workers went and worked in these plants. And that's not what businesses are like anymore. The people who work in it are the means of production. And that's a different way we need to think about it. So I would ideally like to drop the word capitalism because it gives an importance to tangible capital that I don't think it actually has anymore. But I've given up believing that I could persuade people to stop talking in these kind of ways. But the concepts which I wish they could have in their mind is the modern business as a collection of capabilities and a collection of capabilities that are selected to meet the needs of a particular market. That's what I described earlier as the modern meaning of entrepreneurship. It's the person who puts these together. And I would like to talk about capabilities and combinations of capabilities as the basis of understanding the modern firm.
Thank you, Professor K. It's been wonderful chatting with you over the last 9 questions. IG and Charles, over to you for the audience questions, please. Thank you, Professor K. again.
A pleasure to talk.
My pleasure. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Professor K. And IG, you've been listening into the conversation at the back end along with our special guests. And there are other questions as well that you've been curating. So would you like to come in and take that in and bring the others on board as well?
Thanks, Charles. Yes, Professor K, there are a few questions, I think, clarificatory in nature, I'd say, about your definition of what constitutes a hollow company. And I think Charles himself has, I think, tried to kind of pick up issue in terms of why you describe Apple as a hollow company, because it's coordinating the entire ecosystem on integrating the entire offering without necessarily doing anything on its own as you described it. But he says if it's an IP-based, in an IP-based economy, isn't that a smart way to operate? That's one. I'll just bung in the other one, which is related to, I think, pharma as well. And he's saying that, look, in this world, given the fact that during COVID, there were pharma companies who got a very narrow, small window to create COVID vaccines. They had to, in some ways, give up a lot of what they traditionally did and become nimble and agile and outsource some of it to other partners. how do we best understand what you mean by hollow companies? So it's more a clarificatory question, I think. And there's one more from MK Mar. He's asking about consumer package companies in India having focused only on R&D and marketing in India, and outsource the rest of it, including distribution and everything else. So we've had hollow companies for a while in India, is his larger point. So, but you might want to just kind of take one by one if you like.
Right. And the hollow corporation isn't a new concept. In a sense, the trading companies of several hundred years ago were in many respects hollow companies. But we moved away from hollow companies when we started to have large manufacturing plants of the kind that Henry Ford built or General Motors built and the like. Certainly, first half or 2/3 of the 20th century, we thought of business as being about large plants with assembly lines that produce quantities of stuff on them. Once business started to be less material, basically business dematerialized. Alan Greenspan once said that American GDP, when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve, weighed no more than it had weighed a century ago. I've no idea how he thought he knew that, and nobody has actually made that kind of calculation. But he was making an important point, which is the iPhone illustrates it very well, that the iPhone weighs a couple of 100 grams. Its value lies not in the materials that go into it. Its value lies in the ideas that lie behind it. And that's ideas of design, ideas of coding, etc., etc. It's its value is in ideas, not in the stuff. And the same is true when we look at COVID vaccines and the like. I reckon the Pfizer vaccine is probably the most expensive product per gram that has ever been manufactured. But nobody cares about that. They want the vaccine because of what it does.
Yeah.
And then the value doesn't lie in the stuff. The value lies in the intellectual property that has gone into it. So that's how modern business has evolved, and that's produced the changes which I'm describing. And today we have all kinds of hollow corporations. We have Apple, which coordinates a whole variety of functions in the way in which I've described. It ranges from, we talked about how the Apple phones are assembled by Foxconn in China and now India, I think. The Apple store, the flagship European store in Regent Street, is actually it's jointly owned by the King and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which I think is a pretty good illustration of how the nature of ownership in the modern world has changed. And actually, we know that neither the King nor the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund are in there running the store. It's Apple who are running the store. That's one kind of hollow corporation. There's the franchise. The could be Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, or Starbucks, or for that matter, it could be the large international accounting firms, which are basically franchises of firms in different countries across the world. So the franchise model, in which the center provides the marketing, the branding, and some of the expertise, while different people actually provide the capital and the labor which goes into producing them. And now we have a growing number of companies that are pure intermediaries, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, and the like. that don't own any cars, don't drive any cars, don't own any properties, but actually they put together buyers and sellers who do. And that's another type of modern hollow corporation. It's a world very different from that of Henry Ford, who was actually so obsessive about controlling all aspects of production that there's an area of Brazil called Fordlandia, which he bought in order to have plantations which were producing the rubber that would go into the tires on Ford motor cars. Few people think of business in these terms anymore.
Right, right. No, thank you for that brilliant answer. You also spoke about the whole shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Do we really need a new model for strategy development as well? Moving away from the five forces competitive strategy model that we grew up on, Milton Friedman, Michael Porter, that school?
Right. The five forces model.
This is Vivek. Sorry, this is Vivek Kelkar's question. I think I should add. Yeah.
I mean, what happened really was that Harvard economics department came to a particular view of how industrial economics worked. That the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, they called it, that market structure determined business conduct, which determined performance. And Michael Porter took that framework from the economics department, where it was developed in the 1960s, and took it literally and metaphorically across the Charles River into the Harvard Business School, and that was that was competitive strategy. The trouble with that approach to competitive strategy is it doesn't explain what is really the key question of competitive strategy, which is why do different firms operating in the same environment perform differently? And the question which the modern board ought to be asking itself is what can we do better than other people? And that's what the firms which I've been talking about actually do. Apple isn't the only smartphone maker. Samsung is certainly a competitor. All these companies have competitors, but all these companies have some key points of differentiation. And it's these points of differentiation that generate the economic rents, which are the source and the continuing source of the profits of a company like Apple, or indeed a company like McDonald's.
Terrific. Terrific. There are a few questions, John, that had come in when people registered, and I'll pick up a couple first. The first one is from Saundarya Mukherjee. She, I think, is the CEO of Soundbites and a former colleague of Shiv's as well. And she asks, what do leaders need to do to be more human at the workplace and create space for better work-life balance for everyone, given the current issues surfacing on toxic workplaces?
Right. I think let's think for a moment about that question, is how that question was framed, because an awful lot of discussion about business and nowadays, and indeed the discussion you had a week ago, which I was unable to join, is about creating leaders and leadership for the 20th century, for the 21st century. I think we talk too much about that. It's not, as I'm describing, so much about leadership. It's about getting people to work together, collections of capabilities in the way I describe, the mediating hierarchy. Even more ludicrous way of framing it is to talk about ratifying hierarchy. If I think of the powers the King of England has, notionally, he has the power to dissolve Parliament, approve laws, declare wars, etc., etc. Of course, he doesn't really have these powers. What he is a symbol of a process in which other people do all these things in well-established and approved ways. And his job, insofar as there is a job, is to preside over the process of doing that. So we're not looking in the 21st century, as I see it, for leaders who will go into companies and tell people what to do. We're looking for leaders that will identify the capabilities that exist in a firm, see what are distinctive about these capabilities, and help the process of turning these capabilities into what I describe as collective intelligence, the ability of the organization to solve problems.
Terrific. In fact, I wanted to pick up, you mentioned the conversation on December 6th with Ramesh Srinivasan, the senior partner at McKinsey. You yourself have kind of used the whole hare and tortoise fable to make an interesting observation about consultants and their transformation agenda. That was way back in 2006. Have things changed in the past 15 or so years? Your views, that is.
I think you're thinking of my parable of the hare and the tortoise.
Hare and the tortoise. Sorry.
Yes, and what I talked about there was the tortoise, which was concerned that it wasn't as athletic as the hare, and employed consultants on how they should turn themselves into a hare. And of course, the fallacy behind all that was that both the hare and the tortoise are adapted to the particular environment in which they function and operate, and they're appropriate for that particular environment. And that's why tortoises live for tens, hundreds, in some cases, I think even thousands of years, whereas hares have a relatively short lifespan. And tortoises live in climates in which hares couldn't, and vice versa. So that the idea that the tortoise succeeds by turning itself into a hare is a fantasy. Now, that's key to the way I think about business, which is I've talked again and again about business as a collection of capabilities. But these capabilities need to match the environment within which the firm operates. And that match is an evolutionary process, which is partly accidental and partly design. And it's supervising that evolution that is a key role for, well, I'll call them the leaders of today's businesses. But their role as leaders is very different from the roles that Henry Ford played, as I was describing, in terms of the 20th century corporation.
John, therefore, what you're effectively saying is that cookie cutter prescriptive formulas may not necessarily do the trick, which is sometimes what consultants tend to do.
Yes,
would that be correct?
They come in with basically the same PowerPoint deck to each of their clients. And to go back to when we talked earlier about Michael Porter and that kind of way of thinking about competitive strategy, there are no generic strategies, because if there were generic strategies, then there would be no profits for anyone in adopting them. What creates, and I use again and again the concept of economic rent, which is the return you get from being differentiated. The key question was not how my firm is like the others, but how my firm is differentiated from others. And I ask every firm I go into, really, what can you do that other people can't do? And asking that question is really quite critical.
Brilliant. This is a question that we meant to ask you, but it's also come from Prakash Shishadri Nathan. And he's asking about your good friend and perhaps one of the few philosophers in the management space, Charles Handy, whom we lost recently. How does your concept of 21st century cooperation differ from or align with many of the ideas that he spoke about?
I think my thinking aligns very much with the way Charles approached these issues. And most of all, what I think I learned from Charles was to start thinking about companies as communities, that they weren't organizations, and most of all, that they weren't organizations which were owned by anybody. That I realized one day that asking the question, who owns a corporation, is a hopeless question. No one owns a corporation. A corporation is in this sense a community of people. And I wish we would discard this idea that shareholders own a company. They don't. In fact, I wrote another essay on that, which was, I took a famous book of essays on jurisprudence, which talked about the badges of ownership. And I think very interestingly, it concluded that ownership wasn't a simple concept, but that ownership, the meaning of ownership was a variety of relations. And you could say you own your umbrella because you're holding your umbrella. Nobody else is entitled to hold your umbrella. You're responsible for the damage you do with your umbrella and so on. And of course, nobody is responsible for a corporation in that sense. And I said, if someone arrived from Mars, having read this essay and asked who owned Apple or a modern corporation, they'd conclude that insofar as anyone at all did, it was the management. It was Tim Cook. And of course, Tim Cook doesn't own Apple. The concept of ownership just doesn't help. And we do much better to think of corporations as collections of capabilities and communities of people. And that's most of all what I hope to persuade people to do.
Terrific, terrific. This is a question, John, from Parikshit, who's a senior manager with the Tata Group. And he's asking about post-Friedman's doctrine of shareholder value maximization, espoused over a half a century ago. How do you think young managers today can unlearn the philosophy given the prevalent thinking in corporations with a added impact of AI and climate change?
Gosh, I think the largest answer to that is to say that our business schools have to be rather different and have to stop putting the shareholder value mantra at the basis of what they think. And actually, one of the things you may have noticed I do in the book is I talk about the different legal frameworks within which different companies, different jurisdictions operate. That American corporate law is very largely Delaware law because the vast majority of American corporations are registered in Delaware. Not many people know that there's an address in Orchard Street, Wilmington. I can't remember the number offhand, but it's ostensibly the registered office of something like 15,000 corporations. Of course, nobody would have heard of any of these corporations if you turned up. So Delaware law is critical, and shareholder value is probably derived from Delaware law. But it isn't German law. German law quite clearly takes a straightforward stakeholder position. It doesn't give priority to shareholders over workers, customers, suppliers, or anyone else. And British law, rather predictably, strikes a rather strange middle course in which, the key point, as it says, the job of directors is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members. The interesting thing about that is the duty is to promote the success of the company. Now, the shareholders will benefit, or the members of the shareholders will benefit from the success of the company, but it's that way round. And I think it's important to say it is that way round, and that's the history of great corporations. We talked about Boeing earlier. People who created Boeing in the 19th century, in the 20th century, built a great business and that created a lot of shareholder value. And Henry Ford did the same, Alfred Sloan did the same at General Motors, and so on. They built great businesses, and that created shareholder value. That's the way around it is. Someone drew my attention to a book by Bill Walsh, who was regarded as America's #1 football coach for some time. And his autobiography had the title, "The Score Takes Care of Itself." And that's a very good way of thinking about it.
That's a lovely, yeah. I'll move to another question that Swarup Gupta is asking. He represents the Economist Intelligence Unit in India. And he's asking, what is your view on the ESG and sustainability movement? And his context is that, do you think there's excessive focus on greenwashing and data availability detracted from the virtues of these efforts?
I think there is. I think what has happened with, it was first the CSR movement and then the ESG movement, is that you've enabled companies to sort of outsource their thinking about ethics. So we have a department that worries about environmental aspects, while we, in the rest of the business, we can go on, we can focus on making money. I have an interesting story, illustrative story there about ICI, which of course was Britain's leading industrial company for most of the 20th century.
Yeah.
In the early 90s, it changed its mission statement from what it had been historically, which was the business of ICI is the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. That was the basis of the ICI's activities. And first, it began as a company in dyestuffs and explosives. It moves into petrochemicals and fertilizers. Eventually, it moved into pharmaceuticals, which became, towards the end, the main profit driver for the company. That was the great business that ICI developed. In the early 90s, it changed its mission statement to our purpose is to create shareholder value by focusing on businesses in which we have a competitive advantage and cost leadership. That business actually lasted 15 years. But I told that in 2007, what remained of it was taken over by the Dutch company Axos Nobel.
Yes.
I told that story at a conference in 2006, just before ICI finally disappeared. And a few days later, I got a very pained letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. The letter said roughly that ICI might have screwed up its business, but did a great job on corporate social responsibility. And I thought, you so fail to understand what corporate social responsibility really does mean. The brochure, as you can imagine, was printed on recycled paper and had pictures of happy ethnic minorities and disabled people in their jobs at ICI. Now, these things aren't bad, but they're not what business ethics is about. Business ethics is about the kind of things that we've been talking about in this conversation.
Yeah. No, the wheel has come full circle in India. We had ICI here in a fairly dominant position at one time. They sold to Axo, and now Axo's put the India business on sale. So I think the wheel has come full circle in terms of shareholder value. But I had another question which we had kind of decided to ask you about radical uncertainty. It's a term that you use as a defining feature of the modern business environment. But how does uncertainty affect the way successful businesses operate, to your mind?
Well, the keys are by radical uncertainty. Yeah. We're really talking about uncertainty that can't be substantially quantified.
Yes.
Which is most of the uncertainty that people really do face in business. There are people who want to turn all uncertainties into discussions of probabilities. And you simply can't do that in most cases. Most of the uncertainty that modern businesses face can't be described in that way. For me, the key to coping with uncertainty of that kind comes from people who design complex engineering systems. And they talk about resilience and modularity and redundancy. You want to create systems in which part can fail without the whole thing necessarily failing. That's modularity. And redundancy is you build things with more tolerance than you think they need, so that you are resilient to things you can't anticipate. One of the aspects of the shareholder value story is that in the last 20, 30 years, modularity and redundancy have been regarded as signs of inefficiency. And in place of modularity, you want to have higher levels of integration. In place of redundancy, you want to have minimal redundancy. I think the COVID pandemic taught a lot of people that kind of efficiency isn't necessarily as desirable as people thought it was. And I hope people will take that lesson and apply it in businesses in future.
That's right. In fact, we've always learned that Slack is an important part of the innovation system, right?
Yes.
Building some Slack at least. Yeah.
And the financial sector is the best example of a sector which sought to eliminate these things, and in the process of doing so, made itself enormously more fragile, as we learned very clearly in 2008.
Sure. I'm just conscious of the time, John. So I'm going to just quickly bung in one last question to you, which you described, collective intelligence as a factor in the success of modern businesses. And you said that it's not just about smart individuals, but about a group of people, like you described, who have the knowledge and the skills to solve problems and innovate. And that it's not always about core competence as defined by leaders, but a range of capabilities. I know you've answered this in some way, but if one were to kind of summarize what you meant when you talked about Apple and how it goes about developing a broad set of capabilities that help them succeed, what would they broadly be? A very crisp summary of what you've... Yeah.
I think the two concepts I'd really like people to take away from this are collective knowledge and collective intelligence.
Right.
And what I mean by collective knowledge is the assembly of things that groups of people know. And nobody knows much about everything, or everything about anything, really. Collective intelligence, collective knowledge says we know more as a group than we do as individuals. And understanding that is really important. Collective intelligence is that then taking that knowledge together and applying it to real problems. And I give a number of examples in the book about how people have developed that. But it's a combination of collective knowledge transformed into collective intelligence that has been the source of economic progress for the last 200 years.
And sometimes we lose sight of that when we do large-scale retrenchments without necessarily understanding the implications on residual memory and everything else. But this has been a fantastic session. I'm going to toss it back to Charles for some of his closing remarks. But thank you so much for patiently,
Thank you.
I think, responding to all the questions.
Well, thank you, IG. There's a shout out to Ayush Soni in the background, who's been managing the back end and hosting the conversation there and passing the questions on. Ayush, I wish I could pull you up on screen out here so that you could say hi to Professor K and Shiv. But thank you so much for that, and a shout out from all of us out here. Shiv, thank you so much for your sharp questions. This would not have been possible without you. Professor K, thank you so much for your time. And for those of you who have stayed with us until now, you know that this session, there's a video recording that will follow, and my colleague Sweta Basrao will send a handcrafted note which contains all the key points that I've engaged. There's a dear friend of ours, Biju Dominic, who's visible on screen. So I'd like to say a big hello to Biju out here. And I'm also very excited to share that tomorrow there's yet another exciting theme that we will be discussing. And Shiv, I know that this would be straight up your street as well. And I hope you join us. We're discussing the Bangalore Literature Festival. That is one of those key festivals that is survives without patronage from corporate sponsors. And V. Ravichander is the person who has made that happen. And then on the other hand, there is Shivendra Singh Dungarpur, who has single-handedly revived the Film Heritage Foundation. And, these are important cultural things. Events, and how do you make this happen? How did they do it? So we're having an AMA with them between 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. and we'd really like it if those of you are logged in, please do join in. And before you exit, may I request you to offer us feedback in just one word on how this session landed with you in the chat box. That will mean a lot to us. And while you put in that one word, I'm going to ask Professor K, if there will be one business book that you would recommend, like how Shiv has recommended, what would that one book be and why?
A recent book, Charles?
A recent book, ideally, yes, that you have read. I can see there are a lot of books behind.
Yeah, there are a lot of books. And in the last 2 or 3 months, the book I've read and really enjoyed has been Hannah Rich's book, Not the End of the World, which is a sensible, measured take on environmentalism and sustainability. Someone who cares about the planet, but is not overwhelmed by the kind of greenwashing which we've been discussing in the course of the last hours. I think a lot of people should have that book on their shelves.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been a pleasure, and look forward to staying connected.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
You have a good day, Professor K, and
Thank you.
good night to those of you who